The sand was stained dark in 3 places, and the radio had gone silent for 11 minutes. That's all the operations center knew. Somewhere in the Helmand Valley, 6 Navy SEALs were breathing through their teeth, backs pressed against a mud wall that wouldn't stop the next RPG. The Taliban had them boxed in on 3 sides. Fourth side was a cliff. No one was saying it out loud, but the math was simple. Without air support in the next 15 minutes, those men weren't coming home. The duty officer at Kandahar Airfield stared at the display screen, watching the red icon blink where the SEAL team had last transmitted. Every available Apache was committed 2 valleys over. The F-16s were Winchester, out of ammunition and returning to base. The Predator drone overhead had eyes but no teeth. And then someone in the back of the room said a name that made the younger officers look at each other. Voss is on rotation. She's got an A-10 spun up on the apron. The duty officer didn't move for 3 seconds. Captain Alara Voss. The name carried weight, but not the kind that inspired confidence in a room full of men who'd never flown with her. She was 41 years old, a veteran of the early surge years when the war was still new and brutal. She'd flown close air support back when the A-10 community was a closed circle, back before the Air Force pretended it wanted women in the cockpit of an aircraft built to shred tanks. She'd logged more combat hours than most of the pilots on base combined, but she'd also spent the last 3 years flying training sorties and administrative missions. She hadn't taken a hot call in over 30 months. The younger pilots called her grandma behind her back, not because she was old, but because she flew like someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to have mortars walking toward your position. The duty officer clicked his radio. Dagger 7, this is Watchtower. We have a troops in contact situation. 6 personnel, heavy fire, immediate close air support required. There was a pause, then a voice came back, calm and textured like gravel wrapped in silk. Watchtower, Dagger 7, I copy all, spinning up now, send me the grid. In the operations center, nobody cheered. They just watched the screen and waited to see if the woman they'd written off still remembered how to fight. Alara Voss walked across the tarmac like someone who'd done it 10,000 times, which she had. The heat shimmered in waves off the concrete, bending the horizon into something unstable. Her flight suit was faded in places where the sun had bleached it, and the name tape across her chest was worn smooth. She didn't hurry. Hurrying made you sloppy. The A-10 Thunderbolt II sat low and ugly on the apron, nose canted down like a predator leaning into a scent. The aircraft was older than most of the airmen who serviced it, a relic from the Cold War that had somehow become the most loved and feared platform in close air support. Twin turbofan engines mounted high on the fuselage, straight wings designed for low-altitude loitering. And beneath the nose, the GAU-8 Avenger, a 7-barrel rotary cannon that could chew through armor plating like paper. Alara ran her hand along the fuselage as she approached, feeling the patches where shrapnel had been repaired, the rough spots where heat had warped the skin. This particular warthog had a history, so did she. Her crew chief, a staff sergeant named Holloway, met her at the ladder. He didn't say anything, just handed her the checklist and stepped back. Holloway had been her crew chief for 2 years. He knew better than to ask questions when she had that look on her face. She climbed into the cockpit, settling into the seat with the kind of ease that only comes from muscle memory. The instruments glowed faintly in the shade of the canopy. She began the startup sequence, hands moving across switches and toggles without hesitation, engines spooling up low and throaty. The A-10 didn't roar like a fighter jet. It growled. She keyed the radio. Watchtower, Dagger 7, aircraft is code 1, ready for taxi. The duty officer's voice came back with the grid coordinates and a situation brief. 6 SEALs, 3-sided ambush, estimated 40 enemy combatants with RPGs and heavy machine guns, danger close parameters authorized. Alara copied the information without comment, programming the coordinates into her navigation system. Then she released the brakes and began rolling toward the runway. The younger pilots in the operations center were watching her departure on the camera feed. One of them muttered something about whether she still had it. Another one just shook his head. They didn't know her call sign, and they definitely didn't know the story behind it. The A-10 lifted off the runway with the kind of ungainly grace that made fighter pilots wince. It wasn't built for speed or elegance. It was built to take punishment and deliver devastation, and it did both with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Alara kept the climb shallow, nose pointed toward the mountains that rose like broken teeth along the horizon. The Helmand Valley was 30 minutes out at cruise speed, but she pushed the throttles forward anyway, trading fuel efficiency for time. Time was the one thing those SEALs didn't have. The radio crackled. Dagger 7 watchtower, be advised, enemy has shifted position. They're using the terrain to mask their movements. Predator overhead has limited visibility due to dust and smoke. Alara keyed the mic. Copy, what's the SEAL team's status? Last contact was 4 minutes ago. They've got one wounded. They're requesting immediate fires, danger close, north and east of their position. Danger close. The phrase meant friendly forces were within 600 meters of the target area, close enough that shrapnel and blast effects could kill them as easily as the enemy. It meant precision mattered more than firepower. It meant the margin for error was measured in meters, not miles. Alara checked her weapons loadout. The GAU-8 was loaded with a mix of armor-piercing and high-explosive incendiary rounds, 1,100 rounds ready to fire at a rate of 65 per second. Under the wings, she carried 6 AGM-65 Maverick missiles and 2 LAU-68 rocket pods loaded with hydro rockets. Enough ordnance to level a city block, but she'd have to place every shot with surgical care. The mountains rose ahead, jagged and brown, scarred with wadis and ridgelines that offered 1,000 places to hide. She descended into the valley, dropping to 8,000 feet where she could start scanning for visual reference points. The Predator feed was being piped into her display, but she didn't trust it. Drones saw the world in grayscale and pixels. She needed to see it with her own eyes. The radio came alive again, different voice this time, strained and breathing hard. Any aircraft, this is Kodiak 16. We are taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Request immediate air support. Coordinates follow. Alara recognized the tone. She'd heard it before, years ago, from men who knew they were running out of options. She keyed the mic, her voice calm and steady. Kodiak 16, Dagger 7. Inbound your location, 4 minutes. I need you to mark your position and talk me onto target. The SEAL team leader's name was Lieutenant Marcus Hale, and he was crouched behind a low wall with his rifle pressed against his shoulder, eyes scanning the ridgeline where muzzle flashes flickered like distant fireflies. Blood was soaking through the bandage on Petty Officer Rain's thigh, and the morphine was starting to wear off. Hale could hear him breathing in short, shallow gasps. The Taliban fighters were moving closer, using the terrain to leapfrog from cover to cover. Hale had already burned through 4 magazines, and his men were down to their last frags. The situation was deteriorating fast. When the voice came over the radio, calm and unhurried, Hale felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. But it was a woman's voice, and he'd been in the teams long enough to know that hope could be a dangerous thing. Kodiak 16, Dagger 7. I'm 3 minutes out. I need a position mark and a target description. Hale keyed his radio. Dagger 7, we're at grid November Delta 47328. Enemy is north and east of our position, approximately 200 meters dug in along the ridgeline. We've got RPGs and heavy machine guns. Danger close authorized. Copy all. I need you to pop smoke on your position. Make it red. Hale nodded to his breacher, a thick-shouldered Texan named Vega, who pulled a smoke grenade from his vest and tossed it into the open ground behind their position. Red smoke began billowing into the air, twisting in the wind. 30 seconds later, Hale heard it. Not the high-pitched scream of a fighter jet, but a deeper, rougher sound like something massive and inevitable grinding its way through the sky. He looked up and saw the A-10 coming in low, wings level, nose slightly down. The aircraft looked beaten and scarred, ugly in a way that was almost beautiful. And then he saw the smoke trailing from the right engine, a thin gray line that didn't belong. Hale's heart sank. The pilot's voice came back, still calm. Kodiak 16, I have your red smoke. Identify target. Hale forced himself to focus. Target is on the ridgeline 200 meters north of the smoke. Stone structure with a heavy machine gun, multiple personnel. You've got secondary targets in the wadi to the east. Copy, I'm in hot. The A-10 rolled slightly, lining up for its run. Hale watched and he prayed. Alara saw the red smoke first, a bright smear against the dull brown landscape. She adjusted her approach, angling to come in from the west so the sun would be at her back, making her harder to spot. The right engine was running rough, turbine temperature climbing into the yellow zone. She'd picked up something on takeoff, probably a compressor stall or a damaged blade. It wasn't critical yet, but it would be if she pushed too hard. She ignored it. The ridgeline came into focus, and she saw the stone structure the SEAL team leader had mentioned. It was a low compound, typical of the region, with thick walls and narrow windows. Muzzle flashes flickered from the roofline. She could see movement in the wadi to the east, figures darting between rocks. Alara toggled the master arm switch and selected the GAU-8. Her thumb rested on the trigger. The A-10 shuddered slightly as she descended to 6,000 feet, low enough to see details, high enough to avoid small arms fire. She adjusted her angle, lining up the gun reticle with the compound. The targeting pipper drifted across the roofline. She made a micro-adjustment with the stick, felt the aircraft respond. Then she squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 erupted with a sound like the universe tearing in half, a deep, rolling roar that seemed to shake the air itself. The cannon fired in 2-second bursts, each burst sending 30 shells downrange at 3,800 feet per second. The depleted uranium rounds punched through the compound walls like they were cardboard, detonating inside in a cascade of fire and shrapnel. The heavy machine gun position disintegrated. The roofline collapsed. Bodies tumbled into the dust. Alara pulled up hard, banking to the left, G-forces pressing her into the seat. The right engine coughed, temperature spiking into the red. She throttled back slightly, keeping the engine alive. Below, the SEAL team leader's voice came over the radio. "Good hits, Dagger 7, good hits. We've got secondary targets moving in the wadi east of our position." Alara rolled into her next pass, eyes scanning for movement. She saw them now, 24 fighters moving through the wadi in a loose column trying to flank the SEAL position. She selected the rocket pods and came in fast and low, nose pointed down, wings shuddering in the turbulence. The Hydra rockets launched in a rippling salvo, streaking away from the aircraft in bright white trails. They impacted along the wadi floor in a line of overlapping explosions, throwing dirt and rock and bodies into the air. The shockwave rolled across the valley like a physical thing. Alara pulled up again, this time shallower, conserving energy. The right engine was barely holding together now, temperature maxed out, vibration climbing. She glanced at the instruments and made a decision. She wasn't leaving. "Not yet." The SEAL team leader's voice came back, urgent but controlled. "Dagger 7, we've got more movement on the north ridge. They're trying to reposition a mortar. Can you get eyes on?" Alara banked hard, scanning the ridgeline. It took her 3 seconds to spot them, 4 men manhandling a tube into position behind a rock outcropping. If they got that mortar set up, the SEALs were finished. She selected a Maverick missile and locked the target. The missile's seeker head tracked the heat signature, confirming lock. She fired. The Maverick dropped away from the wing, motor igniting with a burst of flame. It streaked across the valley, following its invisible thread of guidance, and slammed into the rock outcropping with enough force to shatter stone. The mortar team ceased to exist. Alara rolled out of the turn and checked her fuel. She was burning through it faster than planned, the damaged engine guzzling fuel to stay alive. She had maybe 20 minutes of loiter time left. Maybe. The SEAL team leader's voice was different now, touched with something that might have been respect. "Dagger 7, that's all we've got on visual. They're pulling back. You've given us breathing room." Alara keyed the mic. "Copy, I'm staying overhead until you've got extract inbound." There was a pause, then the SEAL team leader spoke again. "Dagger 7, I've got eyes on your aircraft. You're trailing smoke. Are you all right?" Alara glanced at the right engine display. Turbine temperature was pegged at maximum, oil pressure dropping. The engine was dying. She could shut it down and fly on one engine, but that would limit her maneuverability. If the SEALs needed her again, she'd be slow and vulnerable. She made her choice. "Kodiak 16, I'm Code 1. I'll be overhead." Lieutenant Hale stared up at the A-10 circling above them, trailing a thin line of smoke that was getting thicker. He'd flown in enough helicopters and watched enough air support to know what that meant. The pilot was lying, and she was staying anyway. He keyed the radio. "Dagger 7, you need to RTB. We can hold until extract gets here." The response was immediate. "Negative. I'm not leaving you exposed." Hale looked at his men. Vega was reloading magazines with hands that had stopped shaking. Raines was sitting up now, color returning to his face. The other 4 SEALs were spread out in defensive positions, weapons trained on the ridgeline. They were alive because of the pilot circling above them, and they knew it. Hale tried again. "Dagger 7, Watchtower can send another platform. You've done your job. Get your aircraft back to base." There was a long pause. Then the pilot's voice came back, and this time there was an edge to it, something hard and final. "Kodiak 16, I've been flying close air support for 16 years. I've covered more troops in contact than I can count. I've never left anyone on the ground, and I'm not starting today. I'll stay overhead until your wheel's up. End of discussion." Hale closed his eyes for a moment. Then he nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "Copy, Dagger 7, thank you." The next 15 minutes passed in tense silence. The Taliban fighters had pulled back into the rocks, regrouping or retreating. It was hard to tell. The Predator feed showed scattered heat signatures moving away from the SEAL position, but Hale didn't trust it. He'd seen too many ambushes that started with a fake withdrawal. The A-10 continued its slow, deliberate circles overhead, one engine trailing smoke, the other one straining to keep the aircraft aloft. Alara was flying with the kind of precision that came from years of experience, compensating for the damaged engine, adjusting her turns to minimize stress on the airframe. But she was also watching her fuel gauge drop toward the red line. She'd burned through her reserves faster than planned. She had maybe 10 minutes left before she'd be forced to declare an emergency and head back to base. And then the radio exploded with noise. All aircraft, Kodiak 16 is taking fire. We have enemy reinforcements moving in from the west. I say again, enemy reinforcements." Alara snapped the A-10 into a hard bank, eyes scanning the terrain below. She saw them immediately, a column of vehicles moving fast along a dirt road, kicking up rooster tails of dust. Technical trucks with heavy machine guns mounted in the beds. At least 6 vehicles, maybe more. They were 2 minutes out from the SEAL position. She keyed the radio. "Kodiak 16, I've got visual on the convoy. I'm engaging." She didn't wait for a response. She rolled into a dive, nose pointed at the lead vehicle, wings shuddering as the airspeed climbed. The right engine was screaming now, every warning light on the panel lit up like a Christmas tree. Oil pressure was gone. Turbine temperature was beyond redline. The engine was seconds away from catastrophic failure. She selected the GAU-8 and put the reticle on the lead truck. The gun roared and the lead vehicle exploded, flipping end over end in a spray of fire and metal. The vehicles behind it swerved, trying to scatter, but Alara was already adjusting her aim. She walked the cannon fire down the column, each burst tearing through metal and flesh. 2 more vehicles exploded. A 4th veered off the road and rolled into a ditch. And then the right engine seized. There was a violent shudder, a bang that rattled the airframe, and then silence. The turbine had destroyed itself, blades shredding through the casing, fuel lines rupturing. Fire erupted from the engine nacelle, orange flames licking back toward the tail. Alara felt the aircraft yaw hard to the right as the thrust imbalance kicked in. She stomped on the left rudder pedal, correcting and shut down the fuel flow to the dead engine. The fire suppression system activated automatically, dumping halon into the nacelle. The flames flickered and died, leaving only smoke. She was flying on one engine now, 8,000 pounds of titanium and ordnance held aloft by a single turbofan that was working overtime. The A-10 could fly on one engine. It was designed for it. But it was slower, less maneuverable, and every second she stayed in the air increased the risk of losing the second engine. She keyed the radio, her voice still calm. "Kodiak 16, convoy is neutralized. What's your status?" Lieutenant Hale's voice came back, breathless. "Dagger 7, convoy is down." "You just saved our lives, but your aircraft, I'm fine. How long until extract?" The extraction helicopters arrived 9 minutes later, two A-60 Black Hawks flying low and fast, rotors slicing the air into submission. They flared into a hover over the SEAL position, and the team moved with practiced efficiency, loading reins onto the first bird, then piling in themselves. Hale was the last one aboard. He looked up at the A-10 circling overhead, still trailing smoke, and he felt something tighten in his chest. The pilot had stayed. She'd stayed when her aircraft was dying, when she should have turned back, when every instinct must have been screaming at her to save herself. She'd stayed because 6 men on the ground needed her. The Black Hawks lifted off, and Hale keyed his radio one last time. Dagger 7, Kodiak 16, we're wheels up. Thank you for keeping us alive. The pilot's response was quiet, almost soft. Get home safe, Kodiak. Then the A-10 banked away, heading east toward Kandahar, one engine running, the other one a blackened shell. Alara flew with the kind of focus that came from knowing that one mistake would be her last. The single remaining engine was running hot but stable. She had enough fuel to make it back to base if she flew a straight line and didn't push the throttle. The sky was empty around her, just the mountains and the desert stretching out to the horizon. She thought about the SEAL team leader's voice, the way it had changed over the course of the engagement, from skepticism to gratitude, from doubt to respect. She'd heard that progression before many times. It never got old. The radio crackled. Dagger 7, Watchtower, we have you on radar. You're cleared for straighten approach, runway 27. Emergency equipment is standing by. Alara acknowledged and began her descent. The base appeared on the horizon, a cluster of buildings and runways shimmering in the heat. She extended the landing gear and felt the familiar thunk as the wheels locked into place. The approach was stable. The landing was textbook. She rolled out on the runway, and the fire trucks followed her to the apron, ready for a disaster that didn't come. When she shut down the remaining engine and popped the canopy, the silence was profound. She climbed out of the cockpit and stood on the wing, looking at the wreckage of the right engine. It was a miracle the aircraft had held together. Staff Sergeant Holloway was waiting at the base of the ladder, and he didn't say anything when Alara climbed down. He just looked at the destroyed engine, then at her, and shook his head. You flew that thing back on one engine. Alara pulled off her helmet and ran a hand through her hair. It's designed for it. Doesn't mean it's smart. She didn't argue. Holloway was right, but it didn't matter. She'd made the choice, and she'd live with the consequences. The duty officer met her in the debriefing room, along with a major from the operations group and a captain from intelligence. They asked her questions, and she answered them, walking them through the engagement step by step. When she mentioned the engine failure, the major frowned. You continued the engagement after losing an engine. Alara met his eyes. The SEALs were still in contact. That's not standard procedure. Standard procedure doesn't account for 6 men bleeding out in the dirt. The room went quiet. The major looked like he wanted to say something, but the duty officer cut in. Captain Voss, the SEAL team leader, has requested to meet with you. He's in the TOC. Alara nodded and stood. She left the debriefing room and walked across the compound to the Tactical Operations Center. Lieutenant Hale was waiting outside, still in his combat gear. Dust and sweat streaked across his face. When he saw her, he straightened. Captain Voss. She nodded. Lieutenant. Hale hesitated, then extended his hand. I wanted to thank you. What you did today. He stopped, searching for words. You didn't have to stay. You could have turned back when your engine failed, but you stayed, and my men are alive because of it. Alara shook his hand. That's the job. Hale smiled, but it was a sad smile, the kind that came from understanding something at a cost. That's what everyone says, but not everyone does it. He paused. I heard some of the guys on base call you Grandma. I don't know what that's about, but after today, I'd fly with you anywhere. Alara's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Appreciate that, Lieutenant. Hale nodded and walked away. Alara stood there for a moment, watching him go, and then she turned and headed back to her quarters. The story of the engagement spread through the base faster than wildfire. By evening, every pilot in the operations group had heard about the A-10 that flew home on one engine, the female pilot who'd stayed overhead until the SEALs were safe, the danger-close gun runs that had shredded an entire Taliban ambush. The younger pilots, the ones who'd called her Grandma, suddenly found themselves reassessing. One of them, a brash F-16 pilot named Garrett, cornered Holloway in the maintenance hangar. Is it true she really stayed on station after losing an engine? Holloway looked up from the damaged A-10, wiping grease off his hands. You can see the engine for yourself. Turbines destroyed. She flew back on one engine and landed like it was a training sortie. Garrett stared at the wreckage. That's insane. That's Voss. Another pilot, a captain named Lynn, spoke up. I heard she's got more combat hours than anyone on base. Why, she been flying admin missions. Holloway shrugged. You'd have to ask her, but I'll tell you this. She's the best close air support pilot I've ever worked with. She doesn't showboat, doesn't take unnecessary risks, but when it matters, she's there. Every time. The pilots exchanged glances. They were starting to realize that they'd misjudged her, that the nickname they'd given her as a joke was based on ignorance, not insight. Garrett cleared his throat. What's her actual call sign? Holloway smiled, but it was a grim smile. Reaper. The name hung in the air like a weight. Garrett frowned. Reaper, I've never heard anyone use it. That's because she doesn't advertise it, but back in the surge years, everyone knew Reaper. She flew more danger-close missions than anyone, saved more troops than anyone. The Taliban put a bounty on her, $10,000 for anyone who could bring down her A-10. Holloway turned back to the aircraft. She's not Grandma, she never was. She's Reaper, and you just watched her do what she's always done. The pilots stood there in silence, looking at the scarred and battered aircraft, and they understood. That night, Alara sat alone in her quarters, writing the after-action report. She documented the engagement with clinical precision, noting fuel consumption, ordnance expenditure, engine failure parameters. She didn't mention the fear, the weight of the decision to stay, the sound of the SEAL team leader's voice when he realized they were going to live. 2 days later, the squadron commander called Alara into his office. Colonel Brennan was a career officer with sharp eyes and a reputation for running a tight unit. He gestured for Alara to sit. Captain Voss, I've read your after-action report. I've also spoken with Lieutenant Hale and reviewed the Predator footage. Alara waited. Brennan leaned back in his chair. What you did was reckless. You continued an engagement after a catastrophic engine failure. You remained on station when you should have declared an emergency and returned to base. You put yourself and a multi-million-dollar aircraft at risk. Alara met his eyes. The SEALs were in danger close contact. Extraction was 15 minutes out. If I'd left, they would have been overrun. Brennan was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. I know, and that's why I'm not writing you up. But I need you to understand something. You're not expendable. The Air Force can replace an A-10. It can't replace you. Alara didn't respond. Brennan sighed. You've been sidelined for 3 years flying training missions and admin sorties. I know you've been frustrated. I know you think you've been put out to pasture. But the truth is we needed experienced pilots to train the next generation. You were the best choice for that. He paused. But after what you did 2 days ago, I'm reassigning you. You're back on the primary close air support rotation. We need you in the fight. Alara felt something shift inside her, a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying lifting slightly. Thank you, sir. Brennan stood and extended his hand. Welcome back, Reaper. Alara shook his hand and left the office. As she walked across the compound, she saw a group of pilots gathered near the flight line. When they saw her, they stopped talking. One of them, Garrett, stepped forward. Captain Voss, he cleared his throat. We wanted to apologize for the nickname we didn't know. Alara looked at him, then at the others. It's fine. Garrett shook his head. It's not. We judged you without knowing who you are or what you've done. That was wrong. Alara was quiet for a moment, then she said, You're young, you'll learn. Just make sure you learn before it costs someone their life. She walked away, leaving the pilots standing there, and she didn't look back. The weeks that followed were a blur of missions. Alara flew close air support for Marine patrols, Army convoys, Special Forces teams operating deep in the mountains. Every mission was different, but the pattern was the same. Someone on the ground needed help. She provided it. Her reputation grew. The younger pilots started asking her for advice, for tips on how to handle danger-close situations, how to read terrain, how to communicate with ground forces. She answered their questions patiently, without condescension, sharing the knowledge she'd accumulated over 16 years of combat flying. Staff Sergeant Holloway kept her in top condition. working long hours to ensure the aircraft was ready for every mission. He replaced the destroyed engine with a refurbished unit, patched the shrapnel scars, and made sure every system was functioning perfectly. One evening, as Alara was pre-flighting her aircraft, Holloway approached her with something in his hand. "Captain, I wanted to show you this." He handed her a patch. It was a custom design showing an A-10 silhouette with the words Reaper's Warthog stitched beneath it. "The maintenance crew made these. We wanted you to have one." Alara looked at the patch, then at Holloway. "You didn't have to do this." "We wanted to. You've given us something to be proud of." Alara attached the patch to her flight suit next to her name tape. It felt right. The missions continued. Alara flew through dust storms and thunderstorms, through clear skies and moonless nights. She became a fixture in the operations center, a voice on the radio that ground forces learned to trust. When troops were in trouble, they asked for Reaper, and Reaper always came. One mission stood out. A Marine rifle platoon had been pinned down by a coordinated ambush in a narrow valley. They'd lost their lieutenant and 2 squad leaders in the first minutes of the engagement. The platoon sergeant, a hard-bitten veteran named Kowalski, was holding the line with 30 Marines against an enemy force 3 times their size. Alara arrived on station with 2 other A-10s, a flight of 3 Warthogs that turned the valley into a killing ground. They worked in rotation, one aircraft attacking while the other 2 reloaded and repositioned, a continuous cycle of fire and fury that lasted 40 minutes. When it was over, the enemy had retreated, and the Marines were alive. Sergeant Kowalski's voice came over the radio, shaking with exhaustion and relief. "Reaper, this is Warhorse 26. I don't know how to thank you." Alara's response was simple. "Get your Marines home, Sergeant. That's all the thanks I need." But Kowalski wasn't done. "Reaper, I've been in the Corps for 17 years. I've worked with a lot of air support. You're the best I've ever seen. I mean that." Alara felt something tighten in her chest, the same feeling she'd had when Lieutenant Hale thanked her. It was gratitude, but it was also something else. Recognition. Proof that the choices she'd made, the sacrifices she'd endured, mattered. She keyed the mic. "Semper Fi, Warhorse." The words felt right. The months turned into a year. Alara flew over 200 combat missions, more than any other pilot in the squadron. She trained new pilots, mentored young officers, and became the standard against which others measured themselves. The nickname Grandma faded into history, replaced by the respect that came from demonstrated competence. But respect came with a cost. Alara was pushing herself hard, flying longer missions, taking fewer breaks, accepting every assignment that came her way. She told herself it was because the troops needed her, because she had the experience and skill to make a difference. But deep down, she knew it was something else. She was trying to prove something to herself and to the Air Force that had sidelined her for 3 years. She was trying to prove that she still had value, that age and gender didn't define her ability, that she could still do the job better than anyone else. Staff Sergeant Holloway noticed. One evening, as Alara was debriefing after a particularly brutal mission, he pulled her aside. "Captain, you need to slow down." Alara frowned. "I'm fine." "No, you're not. You're flying yourself into the ground. You're taking missions back to back without rest. You're going to burn out, or worse, you're going to make a mistake that gets someone killed." Alara's jaw tightened. "I know my limits." Holloway met her eyes. "Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you're acting like you've got something to prove. And I'm telling you, you don't. Everyone on this base knows who you are and what you're capable of. You don't need to kill yourself to prove it." Alara stared at him, and for a moment she wanted to argue. But she knew he was right. She'd been pushing too hard, driven by a need to make up for the years she'd lost, to prove that she was still the pilot she'd been in the surge years. But the truth was, she wasn't that pilot anymore. She was older, more experienced, more careful, and that wasn't a weakness. It was an evolution. She nodded slowly. "You're right, I'll take a break." Holloway smiled. "Good, because we need you around for a long time, Captain. Don't make us replace you." Alara took 3 days off, the first real break she'd had in months. She spent the time reading, sleeping, and trying to remember what it felt like to not have the weight of lives depending on her. On the 4th day, she returned to the flight line, refreshed and clear-headed. And that's when the call came in. A special forces team operating near the Pakistan border had been compromised. They were surrounded, outnumbered and fighting for their lives. The team leader was requesting immediate close air support, danger close, multiple targets. The operations center was in chaos when Alara walked in. The duty officer looked up, relief flooding his face. "Captain Voss, we need you. Special Forces team is in trouble. Heavy contact. They're calling for Reaper." Alara didn't hesitate. She grabbed her helmet and headed for the flight line. Staff Sergeant Holloway was already there, prepping her aircraft. He looked at her as she approached. "One more time." Alara nodded. "One more time." She climbed into the cockpit and began the startup sequence. The engines roared to life, and the A-10 rolled toward the runway. As she lifted off, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Alara climbed into the fading light, heading toward the sound of gunfire and the voices of men who needed her. She didn't think about the risks, or the odds, or the fact that she was flying into a situation that might not have a clean ending. She just flew, because that's what Reaper did. She flew into the fire and she brought people home. And as the mountains rose ahead, dark and jagged against the dying light, Alara Voss felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt complete. The Special Forces team was 12 men operating in a valley, so remote it didn't have a name on the maps. They'd been tracking a high-value target, a Taliban commander who'd orchestrated attacks across 3 provinces. The mission had gone sideways when a local informant sold them out. Now they were pinned down in a dried-out riverbed, surrounded on 3 sides by fighters who knew the terrain better than they did. Captain Alara Voss heard the desperation in the team leader's voice before she even reached the valley. Any aircraft, this is Granite 3-1. We are in heavy contact, requesting immediate close air support, danger close authorized." Alara keyed the mic. "Granite 3-1, Dagger 7. Inbound your location. Send grid and target description." The team leader, a soft-spoken operator named Chief Warrant Officer Dale Rourke, responded immediately. "Dagger 7, we're at grid Papa Tango 65412. Enemy positions on ridgelands north, east, and south. Estimated 80 to 100 combatants. We've got wounded. We need you now." Alara checked her navigation display. The grid was 22 minutes out, deep in the mountains where the terrain was unforgiving and the valleys were narrow enough to feel like flying through a canyon. She pushed the throttles forward. "Granite 3-1, I'm 15 minutes out. Mark your position with IR strobe." "Copy. IR strobe is active." Alara descended into the valley, dropping to 7,000 feet where she could start picking out terrain features. The sun had set completely now, and the world below was a patchwork of shadows and dim shapes. She activated her night vision systems and began scanning for the IR strobe. She found it 3 minutes later, a pulsing beacon of infrared light invisible to the naked eye but bright as a star through her targeting pod. The Special Forces team was huddled in a depression in the riverbed, returning fire in controlled bursts. She could see muzzle flashes all around them, a semicircle of enemy positions that was tightening like a noose. Alara didn't waste time. She selected the GAU-8 and rolled into her first pass, nose pointed at the northern ridgeline. The gun roared and the ridgeline erupted in fire and dust. She pulled up, banked hard, and came around for another pass, this time targeting the eastern positions. Chief Warrant Officer Rourke watched the A-10 work with the kind of awe that came from understanding just how close they'd been to dying. The pilot was methodical, precise, walking the cannon fire along the enemy positions with surgical accuracy. Every pass was perfectly timed, every burst placed exactly where it needed to be. Within 10 minutes, the enemy fire had slackened. The Taliban fighters were pulling back, retreating into the rocks where the A-10 couldn't follow. Rourke keyed his radio. "Dagger 7, you've suppressed the northern and eastern positions. We've still got movement on the southern ridge. Can you engage?" Alara's voice came back, calm and steady. "Copy, I'm in hot." She rolled into another pass, this time coming in from the west. The southern ridge was a jagged line of rocks and scrub brush, and she could see heat signatures moving among the boulders. She fired a pair of Maverick missiles, and the ridge lit up like daylight. The explosions echoed through the valley, and the movement stopped. Rourke exhaled slowly. "Dagger 7, that's all targets neutralized. Enemy is withdrawing. You've saved our lives." Alara banked away, circling overhead. Granite 3-1, what's your extraction status? Extract is inbound, 20 minutes out. Can you stay overhead? I'm not going anywhere. Rourke felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made him dizzy. He looked at his men, counted the wounded, and thanked whatever deity was listening that they'd gotten Reaper on their call. The extraction helicopters arrived exactly on schedule, two MH-47 Chinooks flying low and fast. They touched down in the riverbed, rotors kicking up dust, and the Special Forces team loaded their wounded and piled aboard. Rourke was the last one on. He looked up at the A-10 circling overhead, silhouetted against the stars, and he made a mental note to find out who the pilot was. He wanted to shake her hand. The Chinooks lifted off, and Alara stayed overhead until they were clear of the valley. Then she turned east and headed back to Kandahar, her fuel gauge low but not critical. The mission was over and 12 more men were going home alive. It was a good night. When Alara landed, the entire maintenance crew was waiting on the apron. Staff Sergeant Holloway stood at the front, arms crossed, a grin on his face. "You're making a habit of this, Captain." Alara climbed out of the cockpit and stretched, her muscles stiff from hours in the seat. "Someone has to," Holloway laughed. "Yeah, but it doesn't always have to be you." Alara didn't respond. She walked across the apron toward the operations center where Colonel Brennan was waiting. He looked at her with an expression that was equal parts pride and exasperation. "Captain Voss, another successful mission, another group of men who owe you their lives." Alara nodded. "They did the hard part, sir. I just provided support." Brennan shook his head. "You do realize you're becoming a legend, right? The troops are starting to request you by name. They want Reaper." Alara felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't pride exactly. It was more like validation. Proof that the years she'd spent flying, the sacrifices she'd made, the battles she'd fought against doubt and skepticism had been worth it. She met Brennan's eyes. "I'm just doing my job, sir." Brennan smiled. "I know, and that's why you're the best." He paused. "There's something I need to tell you. The Chief of Staff of the Air Force is visiting the base next week. He wants to meet you. He's heard about your missions, and he wants to personally thank you for your service." Alara blinked. "The Chief of Staff." "That's right, you've made an impression, Captain, a big one." Alara didn't know what to say. She'd spent her entire career trying to prove herself, trying to earn respect in a community that often didn't want to give it. And now the highest-ranking officer in the Air Force wanted to meet her. It felt surreal. Brennan clapped her on the shoulder. "Get some rest, Captain. You've earned it." Alara nodded and walked back to her quarters. She lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, and thought about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the young woman who joined the Air Force with dreams of flying fighters, only to be told that women didn't belong in combat aircraft. She thought about the years of flight school, the skepticism she'd faced, the condescension from instructors who didn't believe she had what it took. She thought about her first combat mission, the fear and adrenaline, the moment when she realized that lives depended on her decisions. She thought about the nickname Reaper, given to her by a Marine sergeant after she'd saved his platoon from being overrun. She thought about the 3 years of administrative missions, the feeling of being sidelined, of watching younger pilots fly the missions she should have been flying. And she thought about the moment when she'd been given a second chance, when she'd been called back into the fight and proven that she still had what it took. It had been a long road, but she was still here, and she wasn't done yet. The next week, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force arrived at Kandahar Airfield with a small entourage of senior officers. General Marcus Whitfield was a decorated combat veteran with a reputation for integrity and a deep respect for the men and women who served under him. He'd flown F-15s in the Gulf War and knew what it meant to put your life on the line for your country. When he met Captain Alara Voss in the operations center, he extended his hand with a warmth that put her at ease. "Captain Voss, it's an honor to meet you." Alara shook his hand. "The honor is mine, sir." Whitfield gestured to a chair. "Please sit. I've been reading your after-action reports. I've also spoken with several ground commanders who have worked with you. They all say the same thing. You're the best close air support pilot they've ever seen." Alara felt heat rise to her face. "I'm just doing my job, sir." Whitfield smiled. "That's what everyone says, but not everyone does it the way you do. I've read about the mission where you lost an engine and stayed on station to cover a SEAL team. I've read about the Special Forces team you saved last week. I've read about the Marines, the Army patrols, the convoys. You've flown over 200 combat missions in the last year. That's extraordinary, he paused. But what impresses me most is not the number of missions, it's the consistency. Every single report I've read describes the same thing: precision, calm under pressure, a willingness to put yourself at risk to protect others. That's the kind of leadership the Air Force needs. Alara didn't know what to say. Whitfield leaned forward. Captain, I'm here to tell you something. Your career is not over, it's just beginning. General Whitfield pulled a folder from his briefcase and placed it on the table. I'm recommending you for promotion to major. I'm also recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross for your actions in support of the SEAL team, and I'm assigning you to a new position. Alara stared at the folder. Sir, Whitfield opened it, revealing a set of orders. I'm reassigning you to Nelly's Air Force Base. You're going to be an instructor at the weapons school, teaching the next generation of close air support pilots. You'll still fly combat missions on rotation, but your primary role will be training. He paused. The Air Force needs pilots like you, Captain. Pilots who understand what it means to put the mission and the troops first. Pilots who lead by example. I want you to pass that knowledge on. Alara looked at the orders, and she felt a swell of emotion she hadn't expected. For years, she'd fought to prove herself, to earn respect, to be seen as more than a statistic or a diversity checkbox. And now the Chief of Staff of the Air Force was telling her that she was exactly what the service needed. She met Whitfield's eyes. I won't let you down, sir, Whitfield smiled. I know you won't, you never have. He stood and extended his hand again. Thank you for your service, Captain. The Air Force is lucky to have you. Alara shook his hand, and when he left, she sat alone in the operations center, staring at the orders. Staff Sergeant Holloway found her there an hour later. He looked at the folder on the table and grinned. So what's the verdict? Alara looked up at him. I'm going to Nellie's. I'm going to be an instructor. Holloway's grin widened. That's perfect. Those kids at weapons school are going to learn from the best. Alara smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes. I hope so. Holloway clapped her on the shoulder. I know so. And hey, if you ever need a crew chief at Nellie's, you know where to find me. Alara laughed. I'll keep that in mind. She stood and walked out onto the apron where her A-10 sat in the fading light. The aircraft was scarred and patched, a veteran of countless missions just like her. She ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the rough spots and the smooth ones, the history etched into the metal. 3 months later, Captain Alara Voss stood in front of a classroom at Nellie's Air Force Base, looking at 24 young pilots who had been selected for the weapons school. They were the best of the best, hand-picked from squadrons around the world, and they were here to learn how to be even better. Alara had been promoted to major, and the Distinguished Flying Cross now sat in a frame on the wall of her office, next to a photograph of her A-10. But the awards didn't define her. What defined her was the knowledge she carried, the lessons learned from 16 years of flying combat missions, of making life-and-death decisions, of bringing people home. She looked at the young pilots and saw herself, years ago, eager and uncertain, trying to prove that she belonged. She saw the same hunger, the same determination. And she knew that her job was to channel that hunger into skill, to turn determination into competence. She began the lecture. Close air support is not about dropping bombs. It's about understanding the ground commander's intent, communicating clearly, and placing ordnance with precision. It's about knowing when to shoot and when to hold fire. It's about earning the trust of the people who depend on you. She paused, letting the words sink in. You're going to hear a lot of stories about me. Some of them are true, some of them are exaggerated. But here's what matters. Every mission I've flown, every decision I've made has been guided by one principle. The people on the ground come first, always. If you remember that, you'll be a good close air support pilot. If you forget it, you'll be a liability. The pilots listened, and Alara could see the respect in their eyes. She'd earned it not by demanding it, but by demonstrating it. Over the next months, she trained them relentlessly, pushing them to their limits, teaching them the nuances of danger-close engagements, the art of reading terrain, the importance of communication. She flew with them, critiqued them, praised them, and watched them grow. And at the end of the course, when they graduated, she felt a sense of pride that was different from anything she'd felt before. These pilots would go on to save lives, and she'd played a part in that. Her legacy wasn't just the missions she'd flown. It was the knowledge she'd passed on. Years passed. Major Ilara Voss became Lieutenant Colonel Ilara Voss, and then Colonel Ilara Voss. She continued to fly combat missions on rotation, but her primary focus remained on training. She became a fixture at the weapons school, a living embodiment of what it meant to be a close air support pilot. Her students went on to fly missions in conflicts around the world, and many of them credited her with teaching them the skills that kept them and the troops they supported alive. She received letters from ground commanders thanking her for training the pilots who'd saved their lives. She received awards and commendations, but she kept them in a drawer out of sight. The real reward was knowing that she'd made a difference. One day, as she was preparing for another lecture, she received a call from a number she didn't recognize. She answered it, and a familiar voice came through. "Colonel Voss, this is Chief Warrant Officer Dale Rourke. I don't know if you remember me, but you saved my team about 5 years ago, in a valley near the Pakistan border." Ilara smiled. "I remember. How are you, Chief?" Rourke's voice was warm. "I'm good. I'm retired now, living in Colorado, but I wanted to reach out and thank you. I've thought about that night a lot over the years. You didn't just save our lives. You gave us a second chance. I wanted you to know that." Ilara felt her throat tight. "I'm glad you made it home, Chief." "I did. And it's because of you." There was a pause. "Colonel, I have a son. He's 17 and he wants to join the Air Force. He wants to be a pilot. I told him about you and he asked if you'd be willing to talk to him, give him some advice." Ilara didn't hesitate. "Of course, have him call me." They talked for a few more minutes, and when the call ended, Ilara sat at her desk, thinking about the trajectory of her life. She thought about the young woman who joined the Air Force with something to prove. She thought about the years of flying, the battles fought in the sky and on the ground. She thought about the men and women she'd saved, the pilots she'd trained, the legacy she'd built. And she realized that it had all been worth it. Every moment of doubt, every challenge, every sacrifice. Because in the end, she hadn't just been a pilot, she'd been a guardian. And that was something that could never be taken away. Colonel Ilara Voss continued to fly for another 3 years, until the day she decided it was time to step back. She retired from the Air Force with full honors, surrounded by the pilots she'd trained and the commanders she'd served. At her retirement ceremony, General Whitfield, now the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, gave the keynote speech. He spoke about her career, her accomplishments, and the lives she'd saved. He called her a legend, a role model, and a testament to what dedication and skill could achieve. When it was Ilara's turn to speak, she stood at the podium and looked out at the crowd. She saw young pilots, veterans, ground commanders, crew chiefs, and friends, and she spoke from the heart. "I didn't join the Air Force to be a legend. I joined because I wanted to fly and I wanted to serve. Over the years, I've been called a lot of things. Some of them were meant as insults. Some of them were meant as compliments. But the only name that ever mattered to me was the one given to me by a Marine sergeant after my first combat mission. He called me Reaper, not because I brought death, but because I brought life. I kept people alive. That's what I did. That's what I'll always be proud of." She paused, her voice steady. "To the young pilots here today, I want to tell you this. Your career will have ups and downs. You'll face challenges, doubt, and obstacles. But if you stay true to the mission, if you put the people who depend on you first, you'll find your way, and you'll make a difference." She stepped back from the podium and the crowd erupted in applause. Ilara Voss walked off the stage, and as she did, she looked up at the sky. It was clear and blue, the kind of sky that made you want to fly. And for a moment, she imagined herself back in the cockpit of an A-10, engines roaring, heading toward the sound of gunfire and the voices of people who needed her. She smiled, because even though her flying days were over, the legacy of Reaper would live on, in the pilots she'd trained, in the lives she'd saved, in the sky itself.